Good day, everybody. I'd like to start this presentation with a story about what happened the other day. As my wife and I were strolling through the park, I was just about to throw an empty water bottle into the trash when she stopped me and asked, "Honey, why are you doing that?" I didn't quite get the context of the question, so without thinking, I answered her in the simplest way possible. Because I was done. That was my answer. It took me some time to finally understand what she actually meant. Why wasn't I recycling it? Good point. I should have known better, being that I do consider myself an environmentally conscious person. But something else struck me during this conversation of ours. I realized that the obligation to recycle was somewhat observably more ingrained in her than it was in me. Now, why is that? A little background on my wife. She's originally from South Korea, and there they have a highly organized recycling system, at least compared to most quote-unquote leaders of the modern world. Now, this could explain to some degree how my wife may recognize better than I that this plastic water bottle was a renewable product and so on. But she isn't by any means your typical Greenpeace activist, so it doesn't quite explain how adamant she was about it, or how it just seemed more second nature to her than it was to me. Which alludes to another point about South Korea. So not only is their system of recycling highly organized, it's also regulated on a national level. In other words, it's the law over there. And as a result, my wife doesn't see recycling as a choice like I do. She sees it as more of a duty. Now, here in the States, we all pretty much know that recycling is an environmental, if not moral duty. But rarely do most of us in our busy lives keep consistent with that kind of duty. And I believe it's because in this country, household recycling is still presented as a choice. In the United States, there is no national law that mandates recycling. It's pretty much just left up to the states to decide how they want to recycle. And aside from a few success stories here and there, our country has performed below par compared to how much we consume for the most part. This leads us into the subject I want to cover today, which is, should recycling be mandatory in the United States? Or rather, should it be regulated by law on a national level? First, I will briefly go over the definition of recycling, its general benefits, and the positive effects it has had in other parts of the world. Then I will discuss whether or not and why recycling should be mandatory in the United States. Now, what is recycling exactly? Simply put, it's the process of turning used materials into new materials. Things like paper, plastics, glass, rubber, and metals are just a few examples of what can be reprocessed and redistributed in a useful way. It can also take the form of using biodegradable waste for composting, or even donating your clothes to a local Goodwill. All these things are considered recycling. What are the benefits? For starters, recycling saves energy and materials. If you reuse a product, let's say the water bottle from my previous example, you don't need to use a new water bottle next time you get thirsty, which saves the next water bottle from having to be manufactured. And if the manufacturer doesn't have to produce a new water bottle for you, it would decrease the overall amount of energy needed to make them in the first place, which in turn would also decrease their production costs. Recycling can also protect our environment and its inhabitants. If we recycle our trash instead of, let's say, burning it, we produce lower amounts of carbon and lessen our chances of polluting the atmosphere. If we recycle our trash instead of, let's say, throwing it all in a landfill, we reduce the risk of polluting the groundwater of any adjacent communities surrounding that area. If we recycle our paper, we cut less trees down, and in turn prevent the destruction of any wildlife habitats that exist in those areas. These are just a few examples of how recycling can benefit the planet along with everything in it. So how has recycling fared in other parts of the world? Well, according to an article by Alex Gray on the World Economic Forum in 2017, the world's top 4 leaders in recycling were Germany, Wales, Austria, and South Korea. Each recycled between 52 to 56% of their municipal waste. That's about 20 to 25% more than what America estimated to do, which sat around 32%. Gray further explains that what all these countries had in common were government policies that encouraged recycling, such as making it easier for households, good funding, and financial incentives. In South Korea, for example, the government instituted a law that requires residents to separate food waste from other garbage and imposes fines on anyone who does not food recycle. This, according to an article by Maury Rothman on PBS in 2017. By recycling food waste, they were able to process it into things like animal feed and gases that could be used for energy. Rothman states that in the 4 years of implementing this policy, Seoul's overall food waste has decreased by 10%, or in other words, by more than 300 tons of food waste per day. Not bad at all. But aside from policies governed by sanctions, in Germany, financial incentives are used to encourage recycling. According to an article by Justin Barizo in INC in 2016, you can redeem an equivalent of 25 cents by depositing a plastic bottle at a recycling facility in Germany. That's 5 times more money than what you would receive in the United States. Pretty good incentive if you ask me. Today, Germany recycles more than any country in the world, so it may seem that the idea of financial incentives works, because as Barizo puts it, the best way to get people to recycle, just pay them. Money talks, I guess. Now here's the deal. Whether or not sanctions or incentives are used to help a country recycle more is beside the point. The truth is, the reason people in these countries recycle so much more than we do, I believe, is because they have the opportunity to, which leads us back to the story about my wife and the empty water bottle. I wasn't able to recycle it that day, and the reason, as you might have guessed, was because that there was no recycling bin to be found. And trust me, I looked. I simply did not have access to one. Accessibility, that was the missing component to my situation, and I believe it is the missing component to our country's situation. But in order to have accessibility, we need a proper recycling infrastructure, and this can't be possible without at least some form of centralized legislation. Individual states and volunteer programs can't do it alone. There needs to be a national collective effort to create this kind of infrastructure. That way, we as a country can change the way we look at recycling, but it's up to the powers that be to give us that opportunity. Let us review. In conclusion, recycling can preserve resources, conserve energy, and protect the environment. It is proven to be helpful in other parts of the world through fiscal sanctions and incentives. But here in the States, the need for a stronger recycling infrastructure, at this point at least, is more important than any punishment or reward. This change can only be possible through legislation on a national level. In closing, I would like to quote the folk singer and social activist Pete Seeger. If it can't be reduced, reused, repaired, rebuilt, refurbished, refinished, resold, recycled, or composted, then it should be restricted and removed from production. Thank you very much.